again. Welcome to another edition of Arts and Ideas. I'm Sue Swinand. And today is a little special for my husband Lou and me because it's our 50th Arts and Ideas program. And I wanted to just take a moment before I begin with my guest to celebrate that. And I wanted you to meet my husband Lou and realize that he's the guy who does all the camera work and lighting and all the editing and the hard technical stuff, and without him I would never have a show. So well done, Lou, and thanks for all you've done. And now I want to introduce my guest, who is kind of a cornerstone of the arts community in this area for many years. Stephen Jareckie has been, collecting, studying, exhibiting, writing about photography for probably 60 years. And
well, I guess it's at that period of time in Worcester. It began in 1962 when I was at that time registrar at the Worcester Art Museum, and I'd come to Worcester from Utica, New York, and at the time, coming to Worcester, Daniel Catton-Rich, the director of the museum, called me to his office and said, we're going to have a photography show called Ideas and Images, organized by Peter Pollock, an eminent photo historian. And he said, how would you like to collect and exhibit photographs? And he said, I looked at your resume, and it said you're an amateur photographer. I said, yes, absolutely, I'd like that. He said, well, you better start reading, so he told me.
But you were basically trained in fine arts at your undergraduate, and then you did a master's in art history, is that correct?
That's right. And I did my bachelor's work at Lehigh University, graduating in 1951. And after serving 15 months in Korea, I undertook graduate study at Syracuse University. My interest in photography goes back a long ways. I did photographs for the high school yearbook in Madison, New Jersey, and when I went to Lehigh, I joined the camera club because they had a darkroom. Develop and print pictures.
We were just talking about how lots of schools in those days did not have the facilities to offer majors in photography or any of that. So someone who was really knowledgeable about photography and educated in an academic setting was not that common.
The photography it was an extracurricular activity. It was
exactly.
not part of the academic program.
And when did that all change?
Well, that changed in the 70s, but I'd like to go back to my time at Lehigh. The dominant force at that time in photography was the Photographic Society of America, and they had chapters all over the universities and local camera clubs across the country, and they promoted pictorialism, which was something that dated back to the early part of the century, promoted by Stieglitz, but abandoned by Stieglitz before 1915. But anyway, the PSA would send out film strips.
And the PSA, tell our audience, was the
students. And we had film strips on Ansel Adams and on Weston. We studied their works. If you have a film strip, and there'd be a record which would tell you how to give the voice on, give you the verbal descriptions and so forth. That's how that worked at that point.
Wow.
And
so it was very rudimentary, and the study of photography was not anything like it was today.
Not at all. And when at the time, when I picked up photography at Syracuse, I did my master's thesis, which was an architectural study of a mill town in upstate New York. And I took photographs of all the buildings it was a perfectly preserved town called New York Mills. So I photographed the buildings and had to measure them and do all kinds of things. And so as part of my graduate study, my professor was very much interested in upstate architecture, and he would send his grad students out to do projects across upstate New York.
So that kind of brings me to the thought about the function of photography in our culture through the early days, and then as it began to change through the 50s and 60s and 70s. Like in the earliest days when photography first was invented, you know, the wonder of being able to record an image was something people just had a hard time even, it was magic to them.
That's quite true. If you go back to photography was introduced to the United States in September 1839. Louis Jacques Mandé Daguerre announced his invention in Paris in August of 1839. It was given to the world, and he got a pension from the French government for that. And
to tell his methods and
it happened to be that in January of 1839, Samuel F.B. Morse was a teacher at New York University, was in Paris, and he met Daguerre and saw the process and had an advanced look at it. And he was responsible for introducing photography to America.
And it went like fire, didn't it?
It did indeed. And as we go around the gallery, you'll see a product made 24 years after photography was introduced to America. It's a picture taken during the Civil War. We'll talk about that later on.
Of the study of war?
That's right, the art of war.
And the art of war. And when you think about what was possible then, the whole thing to me that must have absolutely driven people crazy is that thought that you could have an image of someone that you loved or a child that you lost, and that you would have that likeness, an actual likeness. Even poor people could have a likeness of family members, and it must have been a fabulous turnaround in the whole cultural. And then to record historic events like the Civil War, we began to be able to see what war really looked like, which was quite a new experience too.
I suppose, the first person to cover war was Roger Fenton, who went to the Crimean War. And he photographed the scene where the charge at Light Brigade took place. And what you see are nothing but the ground covered with cannonballs. That's what remains from that charge. And when the Civil War broke out, Matthew Brady was a prominent portrait photographer in New York and in Washington, and he set out to, he organized a corps of photographers to cover the war. He saw it as an important thing to do. Also, he thought there was money to be made in that project. Of course, sadly, when the war was over, people were sick of war, so the sales were not as great as he thought they would be. But he was there at the first Battle of Bull Run, and he was also at the very end of the war, after General Lee had surrendered and was on parole and gone to Richmond. Brady followed Lee, and in a matter of days after the war, the general reluctantly put on his uniform and posed for Brady at the back porch of his home in Richmond.
So the documentation of something like these catastrophic events or wartime scenes and even in our own time, being able to take the viewer to places where they would never go, you know, the top of a volcano where the lava is flowing, or the undersea. All of these things have really changed. One of the things I think is beautiful in your show here is the portraits of the Indians that are so wonderful and would never have been seen or kept or recorded.
In that case, the artist had a studio in Omaha, I believe, and when an Indian came into town, he photographed them, and they're very matter of fact, very photographs.
Straightforward.
Very straightforward.
As opposed to the Curtis, maybe?
Curtis produced a 30-volume set of photographs, but they're romanticized. And
he set them up like Cindy Sherman.
He carried around feather bonnets and things. He didn't have the right outfit. He put them in the right outfit.
Yeah, yeah.
But he contributed nevertheless.
Oh, definitely.
Reinhardt gives you the straight picture. That's
of what the Indian was choosing to wear and what his local costume might be.
Those pictures, by the way, were purchased by Jude Peterson, and Jude Peterson was a major donor to the Fitchburg Art Museum.
Mm-hmm.
And Jude had a collection. He exhibited, he put on shows, and in the course of his lifetime, he had a strong interest in Indian. And
I see.
so that's the reason.
You have a strong suit in that area.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. Now, you collected for the Worcester Art Museum for how many years? Or?
Roughly from 1962 to 1996.
So you were really there on the front line as photography became a major art subject or a major art field.
Exactly true. I might just step back. When I worked in Utica at the Munson Williams Proctor Institute, the institute was one of the venues for the Family of Man, organized by Edward Steichen. It was a massive show, and the pictures...
And a very famous book from that show also.
The pictures were some cases glued or attached to 4 by 8 foot panels, which were put on screens. It was like an erector set, and photography at that time was, from Steichen's point of view, pictures were expendable. The pictures, when they'd done their job, they could be thrown out. If they got wrecked, it didn't make any difference.
So our whole ideas about what a photograph was and how we should handle it and what its function and purpose were all changing. Because it was a multiple, it was considered expendable.
Of course, that was contrary. Photography, the first museum to promote photography, it's a Museum of Modern Art, and the trustee at MoMA that got it going was David Hunter McAlpin, and there are pictures in this gallery of McAlpin, and he was a close friend of O'Keeffe, but he was also a close friend of Ansel Adams, and he invited Ansel Adams to come to New York and work with the art historian Beaumont Newhall to start the department at the Museum of Modern Art. And
the photography department.
And that was the first photography department. And though you might say the Smithsonian or the Library of Congress, of course, collected photographs, but they weren't thinking in those terms.
They weren't thinking of art, they were thinking of documentation. Is that right?
But that's right. But then you find that the Metropolitan actually had a collection, and actually Boston had a small collection. Works given by Alfred Stieglitz in the 1920s, but it's something people don't know about. But you'll find that the Art Institute of Chicago soon became involved under Rich when he was director of Chicago for 20 years. And Beaumont Newhall was invited to become director of George Eastman House in the late 40s. There was a very curious situation in that Newhall was the curator, or started the department in 1940. He went off to war, and his wife, Nancy Newhall, ran the department. Newhall came back from the war, and at that time, Edward Steichen, who was a well-known fashion photographer, had helped Stieglitz in the early part of the century, and he apparently persuaded the trustees of the Museum of Modern Art to make him director of photography and put him over Newhall. And then he invited Newhall to become his curator, which he already was, and Newhall said no thanks. So I don't know if I should be telling you this, but that's the story. And people in Rochester got a hold of him, and they established a major museum under Newhall's direction. So that's where things started.
Yeah. So then you eventually came to the Fitchburg Art Museum and started here, and now you've put together this wonderful show, which is sort of a little bit of a history in itself. And you know, I was looking in the first room, it's kind of chronologically set, and I really enjoyed seeing the first room where there were some of the hand-colored photographs. How is that, at what point was that being done?
Well, color, photographers have wanted to introduce color since the very beginning. And there was a case, there was a famous portrait studio called Southworth and Hawes in Boston. Albert Sand Southworth and Josiah Johnson Hawes were the proprietors. And Albert Sand Southworth's sister Nancy was employed by the firm to add color to their daguerreotypes. So she was hand painting daguerreotypes. And then as you go on further, you find
and of course the daguerreotypes were one of a kind, weren't they?
That's right, they're single items. And people wanted color, and then people began hand coloring tintypes. When the tintype replaced the daguerreotype around...
because that made it more lifelike.
That's right. And
more like a painting.
And then you find the French company Lumiere introduced color photography in the first decade of the 20th century. It was a complex, multi-layered, you had to have different...
But the real general use of color didn't come in until about what time?
1930s.
1930s?
You find that the Kodachrome was a big breakthrough in the mid-30s.
Which made it affordable and not so complicated and a little bit more durable and all of the above?
That's right. The Kodachrome were transparencies, positive transparencies, as you ended up with. And also, the German firm Agfa and Kodak were both competing to produce color negative material. And they were on the market, but they're not very high quality. But if you want to step back, again, say to the beginning of the early 20th century, people wanted color. You find Wallace Nutting, who had a studio in Framingham, would hand color photographs he made, and we have 3 of them on view
in this show.
In this show, so
excellent. Yeah. You know, the other thing that I found really interesting about talking about photography and wanting the photographs, you know, they had that whole period of those grand landscapes where people were going out and photographing the West and photographing South America, you know, people like Bierstadt type photographs that were showing people things they had never seen before. But so there was that influence to make photographs that were like paintings, but we were talking about the influence that photography had on painters like Degas. And then also the strange relationship that, so painting had influence on photography, but photography had influence on painting as well.
That's correct. Degas himself was a photographer, and if you see pictures in the races, you'll find that you see half a carriage wheel and half a carriage, and he wants you to think it's like a snapshot, and he wants you to look beyond the frame. He wants you to look at the picture frame and you visually, and you turn your eye and say, gee, there's more beyond this picture than what I see.
Yeah. And so it was a moment in time. It was a way of thinking about time and capturing a moment. And before and after were almost assumed or understood. And you were just taking that one little piece. So there was a lot of influence in the way things were framed because of the viewfinder of the camera. Artists and painters looked at things from different vantage points. You know.
That leads, I think, we were talking about earlier, Beaumont Newhall was an art historian, and he was the first curator. And he wrote a history of photography, which is still the premier history. It's one I recommend it. If anyone wants to dig into photography and its history, Beaumont Newhall's History of Photography is the book to go to. You can get it through Amazon, I'm sure.
So we're actually sitting in the second room, second gallery of the exhibition that you've put together this summer. What's the title of this show? Building a Collection,
Photography at the Fitchburg Art Museum. Actually, when the new director came on board, Nicholas Capasso, we had some meetings, and the idea when we came to the realization, we had 450 photographs in the collection, and there's a considerable enough breadth to show the collection and give people a taste of different parts of the history of photography.
Yeah.
So we
Sort of a historical survey.
So then we put the show together and opened it March 6th. And the first gallery covers photography up to Alfred Stieglitz's time he photographed the steerage. That's a major picture we have. And the second gallery we're sitting in covers from 1929 up to 1940.
So these would include all the photographs of the Depression era, and Dorothea Lange.
It's also an aesthetic change in photography. Art photography up to around 1915 was pictorial and more idyllic in the way they presented the American landscape.
Pretty pictures.
American culture, that's right. And then you come along with Charles Sheeler from Philadelphia, who gives you sharp, focused, real pictures of what's out there, like Shard Cathedral.
A different way of seeing.
And it is a reaction against pictorialism.
And also maybe a response to Cubism and the modernists. And
that's right. And then the Farm Security Administration, this is an offshoot of applying, looking at the real world. And President Roosevelt wanted to record what was going on in the depressed areas of the United States. So this corps of photographers are organized and set out there. So we have a very good collection. And basically, it's centered around a portfolio produced by Arthur Rothstein, who was a lead photographer, as we mentioned, of the Farm Security Administration.
And then the last room?
Before we hit the last room, we have the Western landscape. Ansel Adams pictures and so forth. And in the last room we have post-1945, and where you begin to see changes. And one of the prime people there is Minor White, who had a very aesthetic view about photography. He was someone into Zen, and he's a mystic. But he taught Paul Caponegro, whose pictures of Stonehenge are on view, very sharp focus. Pictures of England's most important monuments. And then another student is Carl Carenza, who was a retired professor from U of R in Rochester. But Carl does abstract photography, and he creates what's called landscape of the mind. And that you take your own life experience and you look at one of Carl's pictures and you interpret it according to your life experience. That's how he wants you to look at it.
You know, I often think of photography as being a revelation in many ways, because it shows you things that you didn't notice, or it shows you things that you're incapable of seeing with the naked eye. Like, you think about the Egerton photographs. Tell us about those a little bit.
Well, the Egerton, that gallery, our third gallery, covers work that artists who've been shown in Fitchburg since I started in 1996. And Egerton, we had an Egerton show in 1999, I believe. And Egerton's extremely important because he invented electronic flash and stroboscopic photography. And we have milk drop coronet and a bullet going through a card, and those are two very extraordinary pictures showing how you can stop time and give you that slice of a second. The other pictures we have are a series of pictures taken in Japan by Chester Michaelek, and he understands the Japanese culture, and he conveys that through his color photographs. And then we had an exhibition about Italy related to the allure of Italy in 2009. We have.
And these were all shows that you put together and curated and wrote the catalogs and did all the.
Well, we curated them. So we had pamphlets, and we didn't have catalogs, but we had printed material.
Yes.
But the Italian show, yes, there was a catalog. That was important.
Yeah.
As we showed technology and all aspects of Italian contribution from 1945
Well,
on.
photography is really a way of studying the world we live in and sharing it with other cultures, and that certainly is very evident in this show. And you know, I think it's a terrific show, and you've been doing a wonderful job here for the last how many years?
Well, it's going on 17, I believe.
17 years at Fitchburg.
Yeah.
Well, it's a history that people can come and look at where we've been, how we got there, where we're going. It's a wonderful exhibition, and I'm afraid that's probably, is that about all we have time for today? And I want to thank you so much for coming in and taking time to share all your history with us. And I do appreciate it. And I hope you'll come down to the Fitchburg Art Museum, because there are quite a few outstanding shows here right now, in addition to this historical photography survey. So we look forward to seeing you again next time for another edition of Arts and Ideas.